musical offering to His Royal Majesty in Prussia, most submissively dedicated by Johann Sebastian Bach. Most gracious King, in deepest humility I dedicate herewith to your Majesty a musical offering, the noblest part of which derives from your Majesty's own august hand. With awesome pleasure I still remember the very special royal grace when, some time ago, during my visit in Potsdam, your Majesty's self deigned to play to me a theme for a fugue upon the clavier, and at the same time charged me most graciously to carry it out in your Majesty's most august presence. This resolve has now been carried out as well as possible, and it has none other than this irreproachable intent, to glorify, if only in a small point, the fame of a monarch whose greatness and power, as in all the sciences of war and peace, so especially in music, everyone must admire and revere. Leipzig, July 7th, 1747. This was the dedication for the musical offering that Bach wrote to King Frederick II of Prussia. In it, Bach acknowledges the king's greatness in war, peace, and music. Although Frederick had only ascended to the Prussian throne a few years before this, in 1740, he had already proven himself to be a highly gifted military strategist. Frederick was also passionately committed to the humanist ideals of the Enlightenment, but music was perhaps his greatest passion. He was quite an accomplished composer and flute player, performing in nightly concerts at the palace, as seen in this 19th century reimagining of the scene by Adolf von Menzel. When King Frederick heard that old Bach had arrived in Potsdam on May 7th, he promptly canceled that evening's concert and invited Bach to try out the forte pianos in his collection, which were scattered around the palace. A contemporary press release describes how the king went to a forte piano, played the theme, and asked Bach to execute it as a fugue. Bach did so, and according to the press release, all those present were seized with astonishment. The three-part fugue, the Ricercar Tre, that was included in the musical offering is thought to be a pretty accurate rendition of the fugue Bach improvised that night. It should come as no surprise to us that if Bach was able to improvise such a piece with no preparation, he could probably remember what he had played to. Apparently that second night at the palace, Bach declined to extemporize a six-part fugue based on the king's theme, but instead chose a theme of his own, still an amazing feat of improvisation. Tune in next week to hear about that six-part fugue, the Ricercar Tre, composed by Bach and included in the musical offering that was based on the king's theme. In today's episode, we start with two more canons and end with the Ricercar Tre, the marvelous three-part fugue that set the whole piece in motion. In Bach's original edition of the musical offering, this perpetual canon was printed at the end of the sonata. Notice that for this canon, Bach specifies the instrumentation, flute, violin, and continuo, which is the same as for that of the sonata. The continuo part shows both the bass line, which would be played by the left hand of the harpsichord, and doubled by a bass instrument such as the cello, and the third bass figures, which show the harpsichord player which chords to play as an accompaniment with the right hand. The trio sonata itself is a real gem, something to look forward to in episode 4. If we look at the first entrance of the flute, we see that it's a variation on the king's theme. We hear C, E flat, G, A flat, B. But it's now taken on some of the lighter character of the trio sonata. This is done by varying the rhythms, creating a succession of smaller gestures, and bringing out the contrast of characters in the different sections of the melody. The theme is also extended by a few bars, with a second iteration of the descending chromatic scale passage and some added instrumental figuration towards the end. Let's hear it. The violin part, which enters 2 measures later, is an exact inversion of the flute part. It's funny how well the theme works upside down, though it does have a somewhat different character. This is an exact inversion of the intervals, so while the first theme is in C minor, the inversion starts out implying C major with an E natural instead of an E flat. So the flute begins, and the violin responds. You also hear the change of character in the chromatic scales, which had a feeling of cascading down and relaxing in the original flute theme, while they build suspense as they go up in the violin inversion. Here's the inversion. The continuo line is independent of the king's theme, though not entirely. Bach is aware of the many implications and possible permutations of every motive and every musical ingredient he uses. Snippets of these imitations, variations, and reflections of the motives show up in the accompaniment parts too. We can see this in the very opening of the cello part, whose pitches are an exact imitation of the first 4 notes of the theme. So the flute plays, and the cello plays, so the same thing 2 octaves down. Incidentally, this is also the same bass figure he used at the beginning of the Fuga Canonica, which you can see here. So the Fuga Canonica, same thing in the canone. After the initial statement of the new version of the king's theme, there is a 4-measure transitional passage that we see here. And then the flute enters again. But this time, the flute plays the theme in inversion, in the key of the minor dominant, with the violin following with the original version, but with B natural, so again implying the major tonality. So here's the flute's second entrance. And the violin response here. One more example of Bach's circuit of ideas and connections is that just as the flute is getting ready to take the repeat, the bass line signals that the return is coming by playing the opening of the king's theme itself. So here is where the flute will come back, and just before we hear the cello, and then the flute. Bach delighted in these kinds of musical games, but he shows his true mastery in the good taste and judgment with which he selects the most impactful and delightful uses of his material. Bach intended this composition to be enjoyable as a piece of music, not just as a mathematical exercise. He trusts that even when we don't consciously recognize how the material is related, it still has a subconscious impact, and he chooses the material he uses for maximal effect, so we respond to it quite naturally. In our performance, the canonic parts are played by flute and violin, and the cello plays the bass line alone. As you can see from the score, this next canon belongs with the first group, Super Thema Regium, in which the king's theme is independent from the canonic voices. This canon appears at the bottom of the last page of the Ricercar tray in the edition of the musical offering that Bach presented to the king.
Here, the king's theme is on the upper staff, in alto clef, with some rhythmic changes. There are now 2 beats of rest after the first motive, and the cadential figure at the end also is expanded by about 2 beats. This is how it goes. And then it repeats, and so on. You can see that the first voice begins just after the start of the king's theme, and the second voice will start here, 1 measure later at the cymbal. The clefs for the canonic voices are G on the second line, treble clef, for the starting voice, and a very unusual positioning of the F clef here on the top line for the second voice. It shows us that the second voice comes in 2 octaves below the first voice, also on an A flat. So this is what that will sound like, and you can probably see it a little better in the realization. So that's with the king's theme, first voice, second voice. The spacing of the voices creates an attractively clear texture. The voices never cross each other. They're always divided into the high, middle, and low registers. The only place they overlap is on the last note of the king's theme, which is also its first note, as it repeats every time. Here it coincides with the arrival note of the lowest voice. I'll start here so you can hear this. There they are together, and so on. In our version, the king's theme will be played on the violin, and the 2 canonic voices will each be played on the harp.
So what is a fugue? The word fugue comes from fuga, meaning flight, like running away. This refers to the succession of voices in imitation, as if they were chasing each other. Properly speaking, fugue refers more to a compositional process than to a precisely defined form. Bach's interest in fugues and his huge number of fugal compositions are in large part responsible for the idea we have today of fugal form. Bach was a very active teacher, and many of his students went on to become influential composers, performers, and teachers, among them several of his own children. For Bach, contrapuntal writing was an essential compositional skill, and he was frustrated by the dearth of high-quality musical examples he could use to demonstrate his process. Bach completed the first version of his composition, The Art of the Fugue, in 1742, to serve this pedagogical function. Like the musical offering, its movements are based on a single theme, which actually has some similarities to the theme of the musical offering. In the art of the fugue, Bach takes his theme through many of the same kinds of permutations we've discussed previously: imitation at various pitch levels, inversion, augmentation and diminution, and even varying the theme by using different metrical meters. But here, the exploration of the material is done in the context of a larger 3 or 4 voice fugue. Bach set out expanding and revising the art of the fugue in the late 1740s, but this project was interrupted by his death in 1750. His family and friends recognized the value of the work and published it nonetheless in 1751. His son C.P.E. Bach later commented that it was the most perfect practical fugue work. In 1753, one of Bach's students, Friedrich Wilhelm Marburg, published a treatise on fugal composition that was based primarily on Bach's art of the fugue. In it, Marburg laid out the characteristic elements of Bach's fugues, which he described as the greatest of our time. The 5 parts of a fugue, according to Marburg, are the subject, answer, exposition, counterparts, or as we would say, countersubjects, and episodes. These are basically the terms we use to talk about fugal form today. The fugal subject is another name for the main theme. The answer is the entrance of the second voice playing the theme, but starting at a different pitch level, and often with minor adjustments of the intervals in order for it to fit within the larger harmonic scheme. As in formal writing, the exposition is the first big section, in which all of the voices of the fugue are introduced and perform the theme. The voices come in one by one, alternating between subject or answer forms, and presenting the basic material that will be explored in the fugue. Counterparts, or countersubjects, are the material that the voices perform after having finished the theme, when they're accompanying the next voice that enters. Often this material is quite distinct from the theme, since it needs to avoid interfering with the listener's ability to hear the statement of the theme clearly. But the countersubject is often in part derived from the theme. As we've seen previously, Bach was very skilled at generating new material from existing motives, and there's a beauty to be found in evolving as much material as possible from the theme itself. Episodes are areas of the fugue in which the subject and answer are not present. The episodes fulfill various important functions, including modulating to different keys, building energy and suspense, and just providing diversion from the more rigorously structured sections of the fugue. In Bach, this often takes the form of kind of riffing on the various motives he's established in the exposition. In a typical fugue, following the episode, you'll find another version of the exposition, with all of the voices taking turns performing the subject and answer again, but often in a different order of the voices, and most importantly, in a different key. This is then typically followed by another episode, which brings us back to a kind of recapitulation of the initial exposition, with the theme back in its original key. There are endless variations of this format. Bach explored many of them in his huge body of fugal compositions, but these are the broad strokes. It's very helpful to have an idea for what the norm is in order to appreciate the pieces that follow different rules. Though fugal writing fell very much out of fashion during Bach's lifetime, many of his contemporaries did appreciate his work, and countless composers from successive generations have learned from Bach's model. As a young composer in Vienna, Mozart would visit his musical patron, Baron von Swieten, each Sunday to study his collection of fugues by Handel, Bach, and Bach's sons. Von Swieten even asked Mozart to arrange some of these fugues for instrumental ensembles, such as the string trio, so that the works could be more easily performed and enjoyed. Today's performance of the Ricercar Tre by 3 marimbas is done in that spirit. But if this is a fugue, why do I keep calling it a Ricercar? Ricercar is an old-fashioned name for imitative fugal writing, derived from the Italian for to seek, search, or investigate. The dedication copy of the musical offering that was sent to the king included this acrostic, which translates to, "At the king's command, the theme and its solution, resolved in canonical manner." This is Bach, having fun again, now going so far as to create an overlap between the title of the composition, the dedication, and the music itself.
perhaps due in part to the fact that it was a transcription of an improvised fugue. The ricercar doesn't proceed exactly as one might expect. The general form starts as expected with an exposition of the subject and answer, starting with the top voice, then middle, then low, followed by an episode. Next comes a second statement of the subject and answer by the three voices, this time transposed and with a different order of entries, in reverse order from low to high. This is followed by another episode, which uses many of the same ideas we heard in the previous one, and leads naturally into what appears to be the recapitulation, as the bass voice performs the subject of the fugue back in C minor, the tonic. But here, Bach takes a huge detour. He inserts an extended improvisational fantasia into the fugue, just at the point where he seemed ready to wrap it up. When the recapitulation does eventually happen in the original key, it's back in the original order of voices, high, middle, low, which produces a nice parallel with the opening. This time, Bach makes us wait a bit for the final entry, and when the booming bass voice finally comes in with the theme, it's very satisfying. At the end of the theme, Bach tags on a little closing episode, a short revisiting of material from the Fantasia section, in which the bass voice travels down the scale from C to the C an octave below to finish the piece. Let's take a closer look at some of the thematic material Bach uses in this fugue. We have the King's theme, with its three distinct sections: the opening, portentous half notes, the descending chromatic scale, first in half notes, then in quarter notes, and the cadential formula at the end. This was the theme given Bach by the king, so it is the original version. If we look closely at the exposition, we can see that this is what's called a tonal fugue, because the intervals of the answer differ slightly from those of the subject. Rather than starting with two leaps of a third, as we had in the subject, the answer begins with a leap of a third, followed by a second. You can see this here. There's the middle entrance. And then this third note, instead of a D, it's a C. Then it continues as expected. The rhythm and intervals of the answer are close enough to those of the subject that we hear it as essentially the same theme. But there is that one important change note. Notice that the subject began on C, whereas the answer starts on G, the dominant. The counter subject that follows has a strongly contrasting character to the subject, with a series of leaping short notes followed by eighth note scales. You can hear it, see it here in the upper voice. Then there's a short transition that Bach uses to modulate back to C minor for the entrance of the third voice with the subject, back on C. So here are the four measures, and there's our entrance of the third voice on C, which ends there. In the first episode, Bach is riffing on many of the ideas he's already put forward, combining them in new ways, transposing them, and sequencing. So we hear a musical idea repeated, but a little lower or a little higher. Bach adds variety with a new rhythm, a triplet figure traded between the upper voices over the bass, that itself sounds like it might be starting the theme, but turns out to be a false entrance. So here you can see the triplets answered in the upper voice, and underneath, the bass playing what sounds like it could be actually the answer. And then sequenced down. Bach generates energy with syncopated figures in the upper voices over the bass that starts moving twice as fast. And then he combines the triplets with the eighth notes while the bass plays the subject starting on a G. So here you see the syncopation in the upper voices and the quarter notes in the bass line. And eventually then the triplets traded with the eighth notes over the theme. So there's our subject. This accompaniment is completely different than we had the first time. And after the previous false entrance, it takes us a moment to realize that this really is the next entrance of the subject. The second voice comes in here, starting on a C, and the third voice follows here, starting on an F. Bach creates multiple overlapping energy levels. The theme itself is broad and expansive. When the other two voices are exchanging short motives back and forth, they have an eager, chatty quality. And the long lines of eighth note scales have a kind of a languorous feel. Material from the previous episode comes back in the second episode. For example, those traded triplet figures. And then there's the lone entrance of the theme in the bass voice, followed by the fantasia section. So here's the bass, which ends, and then it just goes on and on. Some of the musical ideas you'll hear Bach play with are chromatic scales, the first few notes of the fugal subject, the triplet figure, the scales, and the syncopations. And many of these figures will appear in diminution, so faster, and in different combinations and in different keys. There is a lot of activity, which generates a real feeling of excitement. Finally, the top voice comes in with a theme, back in C minor. Here it is. Answered by the middle voice on G, here. And finally the low voice on C. Followed by that closing descent down the scale, C, B flat, A flat, to the dominant, and then on down to the low C at the end. You can see that compared to the canons, this fugue tells a much larger story with more characters and a lot more drama.
Our performance of the Ricercara tray features 3 marimbas, and I love it. Like the harpsichord, the marimba is essentially a keyboard instrument, but where the harpsichord makes a sound by plucking the strings, a marimba player strikes the bars of the marimba. Either way, once the sound has been produced, it can't be altered. All you can do is to muffle it. But instead of one player, one instrument, and just 2 hands on a harpsichord, we have 3 players and 3 instruments, which makes it easier to perceive the 3 separate voices. The different timbres of the high, middle, and low register of the marimba also help to differentiate those voices. And you'll see that the 3 players use mallets of different size and hardness, which helps bring out the distinctive color of each register. This music is definitely quite complex, and it's easy to feel intimidated by it. But one of the beautiful things about music is that there is no such thing as getting it. As you can probably tell by this very incomplete discussion of Bach's Ricercara tray, there's a lot more going on here than you'll be able to hear or process in a single hearing. And chances are that whether you're conscious of it or not, you'll be noticing new ideas and new relationships between the material on the 10th hearing too. Part of what makes Bach such a good composer, and someone whose music continues to be played and enjoyed by so many people today, is that it isn't just an extremely impressive intellectual exercise. Bach is always striving to express emotion, and in a piece like this, there's a story, there's a narrative arc. He creates different characters. They talk to each other in different combination, creates a sense of suspense, of anticipation. He builds energy, and at the end, he gives the listener a deeply satisfying sense of arrival and completion. There are as many ways of listening to this work as there are people on the planet. So just sit back, keep an open mind and heart, and let the music speak to you in whatever way it catches your interest right now. Thanks so much for watching the second episode of the Princeton Symphony's Bach Musical Offering Project. Tune in next week for episode 3, featuring the 2 Riddle Canons and Bach's astonishing Richer Car essay.